you so much. So thank you everyone for joining me this morning. My name is Julia Ouellette and I'm a registered psychologist. I work for a school division here in the city of Saskatoon. And yeah, I'm just going to present my PDC EAL project that I completed a couple of years ago. And I'm actually kind of using this project as part of I would say, like foundational information for my current PhD program. So I really sincerely enjoyed doing this work. So we're going to take a look at the identification of learning disabilities in EAL learners, factors and methods to consider in the psychoeducational assessment process. And please feel free to jot down any questions that might come up as I take you through this. At the end, I'll try my best to answer any questions that you might have. So here, we're going to look at the assessment process overall because there's a really high incidence actually of misdiagnosis, like misidentification of EAL learners diagnosed with literacy-related specific learning disabilities. And so I kind of wanted to look at these three main parts of assessment to see how can we best avoid misdiagnosis and work together towards more non-discriminatory assessment. So basically, firstly, the referral process is at the top here, and we want a really comprehensive referral process and pre-referral process. And the information, the data collected here should really help to inform the administration of cognitive assessment. So that pink circle. And this is basically kind of a big literature review of these different processes. And so there are things we can do with the administration of cognitive assessment to help really with the interpretation of results, so that next circle, because we want to ensure that there's equity in assessment, that we're, like I said, avoiding misdiagnosis as much as possible, and to make sure that we're just best representing our EAL learners. And then it kind of loops back around because there's also overlap then, even in the interpretation of results, back with the referral process. The referral process provides a lot of initial information that's really important when we're considering a diagnosis. And really what we want is convergence of data. So everything coming together to paint a picture of how we can best support our EAL learners. So this is our agenda for today. So we're going to focus just on these topics. So what are learning disabilities? Then construct validity. So basically our processes examining what we intend to really examine. Are we measuring what we intend to measure? We're going to look at the referral process in terms of pre-referral instruments, as well as learning disabilities versus the process of language acquisition, additional language acquisition. And I have a chart here as a handout that I actually really love, and we'll talk about it, and it kind of helps to separate some different observed behaviors like learning disabilities versus the additional language acquisition behaviors that we see in learning processes. Then we're going to talk about the assessment process for learning disabilities, looking at procedures and instruments, interpreting results. So it's important for us to consider what is cognition? What are we thinking of when we think about thinking? What domains are we measuring? Why are we measuring them? And yeah, what we're looking to get from those domains. I'm also going to kind of take you through each cognitive area in terms of, like, in a perfect world, what the English language benchmarks of an individual would be in order for them to best access each of the cognitive domains. So kind of looking at EAL benchmarks levels, I tried to kind of like piece apart, like, what are we asking students to do and what kind of language skills do they need in order to like be able to show ability. So we're just going to get into that a little bit too. And then the bell curve. So of course, like, our standardized assessments are norm referenced. They're not norm referenced off of the EAL population. So just talking about how to interpret that data most accurately. So that's where we bring in like the culture language interpretive matrix. And then a quick discussion on neurodevelopmental disorders, criteria for specific learning disabilities, and then kind of circling back to assessment needs and reassessment needs. So I know we don't necessarily have a lot of psychologists in a lot of divisions, and unfortunately, like, time to always reassess, but I do feel that reassessment is actually an important part sometimes of the overall assessment process for EAL learners, depending on the case. And then just some final thoughts and questions. Okay, so we're just going to start with just like a broad definition of learning disabilities, just so we're all on the same page in terms of what we're thinking about here. So the Learning Disabilities Association of Canada, they re-endorsed an official definition, 2015. So when we're thinking about learning disabilities in this presentation, this is like referring to several disorders where individuals have at least average overall cognitive functioning, and then there's like, for lack of a better term, like a deficit or weakness um, in one or two cognitive domains that are directly impacting academic learning. And so, like, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, like those disabilities would fall under the umbrella of a specific learning disorder, or in Canada, specific learning disability, according to the DSM-5. So when I was first thinking about like putting this like research and stuff together, doing this literature review, my big question was like, what factors might impact the accurate identification of learning disabilities in EAL learners? So we're basically going to consider different aspects along the assessment continuum in terms of factors that can both like negatively or positively affect construct validity. So, so several major factors initially came to mind for me that can impact the quality of our data. So firstly, difficulty recognizing learning patterns associated with specific learning disabilities kind of versus behaviors that are expected with additional language acquisition. Unchecked bias, like unchecked personal bias. Lack of understanding how student backgrounds affect testing outcomes, timeframes around learning English and exposure to Canadian culture. So, like, we often hear, well, I've often heard like the 5 to 7 year kind of rule. But I think it's really important that timeframes are taken into context with individual presentations. So, like, let's say you have a student who is, let's say, in grade 2, so a fairly young student. Uh, they are not yet toilet trained. They are not maybe able to fluently speak their first language. We don't necessarily need to wait for an assessment, actually, because there's lots of different ways to gather the information we need and to make sure that not only we understand the student better, and potentially like the medical perspective as well can be tailored, but also like families often need support, like respite support through like CLSD. So we don't necessarily want to be waiting like 5 to 7 years to see those students. We can still get the information we need in order to better support them. But like with learning disabilities, we do want to make sure that EAL backgrounds are sufficient enough to allow learners to access standardized assessment and really just to be able to demonstrate their learning capacity. And just so that, again, like the goal, the aim is to serve the students and the families. There's also like major factors around a selection of cognitive assessment procedures and tools. So we actually have lots of different options. And even if EL learners aren't quite at that 5 to 7 year mark, like we can come in with some different processes we'll talk about to better interpret the data. And that brings us to a lot of us often, I still have difficulty interpreting standardized data, especially in the context of diagnosis. It can be pretty complex and just so many factors to consider. Every case is different on a case by case basis. So yeah, there's like internal factors, external factors that really can impact the assessment process. So here we're just we've considered like some factors that can impact our processes. So we're just going to start now by looking at the referral process, and I actually find like the pre-referral process is really important here. So when you're starting to work towards that pre-referral process, you're probably noticing like atypical learning. So, like I find EAL teachers like Heather, I've worked with Heather, but I find EAL teachers amazing at, um, you know, collecting data and also at identifying what is typical progress for an EAL learner in terms of their language acquisition, speaking, listening, reading, writing, and what's atypical. So we want to start with like gathering initial data, progress and behavior monitoring. Personally, like I love to see like a portfolio of work samples from students, including work that the students done like independently as well as with support. Um, Developmental history should be part of this at this stage, should be part of gathering information. And we really want to understand students' development, of course, in their first language. So we have a bit of a picture of their development thus far as they're acquiring an additional language, but how did they do in their first language, their mother tongue? So we want to know things like, when did they say their first words? When did they start putting simple phrases together? Are they able to read in their first language, write in their first language? Are parents or guardians satisfied with how their child is able to speak in their first language? And that's all like really valuable information later in the interpretation processes. And the Alberta Language and Development Questionnaire, I actually find it to be like a pretty good starting point and provides some really good questions. I would like just caution and say like I feel like it's really important to have good relationships with the families before kind of getting in there. You kind of have to get in there a little deep. There are questions about other family members. A lot of diagnoses are genetic, like there's some genetic underpinnings. So there are questions around family members and learning difficulties and things of that nature. But again, when we're trying to figure out what's going on with a learner, just all of this information needs to come together. I also have grown to really love the Ortiz. So that's the guy who came up with the assessment, the Ortiz Picture Vocabulary Acquisition Test, or PVAT. You do need a B level qualification to administer it, but essentially you're able to compare the receptive language of an individual to that of an individual the same age with the same amount of time being exposed to English. So, like we know that, like we'll talk about later, the bell curve, like it's not normed on EAL learners, but the PVAT is. So it's kind of like neat that we can get that kind of comparison. And I know that this isn't typically used for students with learning disabilities, but I just wanted to put it in here too, like for students who really have significant atypical behaviors and you think there might be intellectual disability, even like a mild intellectual disability, where their global functioning is more affected. The use of developmental milestones charts can be helpful. And I've used these starting right from 6 months of age, actually, going all the way up to 7 years of age. And just doing days of observations where like I kind of check, you know, what students are able to do, and then I see where do most of those check marks fall. And these charts, like, they're available online. I would say just make sure they're from a reputable source, but it's good um, if they have like column for like cognition, like conceptual thinking and reasoning, like problem solving behaviors, and then for social and play, motor skills, and then communication. Just lots of information can be gathered that way. And then you can see about where, at like what age level equivalency an individual might be functioning. So again, more for IDD diagnosis, intellectual developmental disorders, but that can be a really helpful pre-referral instrument. And of course, EAL pre-referral checklists, a lot of divisions I hear have these. The division I work for uses one of these as well. But just, I like these checklists because they summarize like school team involvement, who's been involved, what kind of interventions has the student had, like have SLPs been involved, occupational therapy, counselors, that kind of thing. Also, has vision been checked, hearing been checked, what adaptations and accommodations have maybe been implemented to help the student, what are their EAL benchmarks, has any academic testing or like screening even occurred. And so it's just a great way, I think, to summarize a lot of important information, just having a checklist with a couple boxes to kind of note what these kind of different areas look like for particular students. This is just like a note that I kind of kept kind of saying to myself while I was doing the literature review for this stuff. So it was really apparent that data needs to be collected from different sources in different contexts. So from different teachers over different grade levels if possible, and then home and school. And again, it's just in the spirit of helping to minimize like misdiagnosis and get the most information across environments that we can about a student's functioning. So after like all of the information has been gathered, there's like a really good article that I had read, and it was it was speaking to the importance of teacher interpretation. So I was like, yeah, like that's right. So like it's not just that all the information has to come to like a psychologist or whoever might be seeing a student, but also like that initial teacher interpretation of observations and the data that's been compiled. So these are some just key things that need to be recognized in that interpretation. So of course, evaluation needs to recognize time plays a critical role. So, you know, is this referral appropriate at this time? Has the student had an opportunity to access like some good educational opportunities and interventions and to learn English to a sufficient degree? And then, of course, like just talking about that like quality of intervention. And then considering if students are progressing as compared to the expected rate of progress for students of similar backgrounds who are EAL. So that, of course, would come with years of experience and just knowing how learners typically progress. And I know it can be somewhat different for every person, but we're talking about like when there are really significant differences. So, are there significant differences in speaking, listening, reading, and writing? And like between those, are there significant differences? So, like, is speaking and listening coming along okay, but not reading and writing? So, those kind of comparisons can be really helpful. And lastly, of course, it's always good if there can be a teacher lens on attempting to differentiate between learning disabilities versus additional language acquisition behaviors associated with those. So this is the chart that I've appreciated. So on the left, we have behaviors associated with learning disabilities. And then on the right, behaviors associated with additional language acquisition. So like, let's just take like the first like row going like right across. So let's say a learner has difficulty carrying out a series of directions due to short-term memory difficulties or lack of attention. So, okay, but they're learning English as an additional language. So, is that really true, or are there behaviors due to a series of, or do they have difficulty, carrying out a series of directions because of instruction not being well understood? So, basically, what you would do is you'd have to try to kind of like rule out a little bit like the additional language factors. So, um, in this instance, okay, so let's say you pre-teach vocabulary, you simplify instruction or the directions, you use visuals to support processes, and let's say the student still has difficulty carrying out a series of directions, then they may have difficulties related to memory or attentional issues. So it's kind of like going through each of the behaviors and trying to rule out the like as much of the language loading as we can to see if they still have difficulty with each of those behaviors. So if you're kind of trying to meet their needs language wise and they're still having trouble, then there might be kind of more going on, more to the picture, and that could indicate a learning disability. So I'm just going to talk about the process now of assessing students for learning disabilities. Okay, so we've gathered really thorough background information in the pre-referral referral process. So now we're looking to conduct an in-depth understanding of cognitive functioning. And to do that, we want to identify specific processes that might impact learning. And for specific learning disabilities, we're looking at usually 2 or more assessment batteries, and we're going to talk about like the 5 primary cognitive domains that we measure, as well as there's like a few others that we pull in from like the Woodcock cognitive and even the CTOP to help us look at that phonological loop. And even though the referral process might provide lots of great information, we often still have to go back and kind of gather resource teacher information, seek developmental and medical history. Like if there's any, if we still have any questions about these areas. And then, of course, we do the standardized assessment, academic testing, as well as reviewing the student's file and doing our own student observations. But we're going to talk later about how standardized assessment processes can actually be like somewhat tailored, like just to help with this process. And this is just a list of assessment instruments you may see often. So WISC, Woodcock-Johnson, CTOP, Wyatt, or it could be the Woodcock Achievement. So it's really important that a psychologist carefully review the shared information from the referral procedures. Um, and that information can help to determine if there are needs, if there's need for adjustments. So um, this is like a little bit uh, controversial, but there are three main ways in the literature, and this is just one specific example of one of those articles that suggest this is how we can kind of help with the process when we're administering a cognitive assessment. So, firstly, by contextualizing vocabulary. So, basically, by helping to like define words a little bit and make sure there's some understanding. Modifying instructions. So we could either like kind of simplify some of the instructions, especially I would say for more of the nonverbal domains that we're looking at. And we can also do more sample items. And in terms of time limits, so not for processing speed because it would like defeat the purpose, but for other areas, we can look at giving like additional time to students. And what I would say is, if at any point, whether it's for like cognitive assessment or academic assessment, if we're deviating from standardization, it's just really important to note that. And personally, I think it's good to get the standardized score first, um, and then kind of go back and try things a little differently if there's time by trying to implement some of these strategies. Then you could kind of observe how the student does in comparison to the standardized stuff. So, okay, so we've got the pre-referral, the referral process. We've considered like how are we going to potentially go about assessment, like are adjustments maybe going to be needed, and then it's really important for us to recognize like what is cognition, because like what are we asking of our students. So, cognition, I would say, like just broadly, provides us with insight as to how we function in the world. So, we're really looking at like use of language, but also problem solving, memory, processing speed. So, there are five main domains, like five primary areas that we typically always seek to measure. So verbal comprehension at the top, visual spatial reasoning, fluid reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. And these five areas can provide us with a full scale IQ score. Um, when valid, so when you feel like an assessment is a good estimate of ability, um, it's really, I think, interesting to note that full scale IQ is actually still found to be the best predictor of current, but also like future success, like academic success. So, verbal comprehension. So, as you might be able to guess, this is a domain that's very heavily language and culturally loaded. So this is a core problem solving domain where we ask students to basically problem solve using language. So to assess this area, I administer similarities as well as vocabulary. So, similarities is comparing concepts, like how are a river and a mountain alike? Like questions like that. So, abstract categorical reasoning. And then also vocabulary, so looking at lexical knowledge, asking students to define words. So I just think it's really good to have an idea of when we refer a student, what kind of stuff are we actually asking them to do? And like, is it fair, at this point in time? So I feel like to really, in a perfect world, to be able to really access this domain and show your ability, being an independent user, at least like B2, um, would be like appropriate here. And again, it's not a perfect world, but like with my example there, like how are a river and a mountain alike, you can probably get an idea of the kind of like conceptual kind of, yeah, like somersaults you kind of have to do language wise to really kind of figure out a good response. Okay, so visual spatial processing. So this is more of a nonverbal index. So this is measuring our organization and manipulation of visual spatial information. And to assess this area, we often administer like block design. So students are given blocks. They have to make those blocks match a picture, like a stimulus. And then visual puzzles. So for visual puzzles, they aren't actually given the pieces, but they have to mentally determine what pieces they would put together to make a picture. So we're looking at, more nonverbal tasks. So I think still though, because of like the instruction, like independent user would be ideal, like B1 would be probably good for this domain. So fluid reasoning, so this is another, I feel like this is really important when we see EAL learners, because this is another core problem solving process or domain similar to verbal comprehension, except instead of you asking students to solve problems using language, we're asking them to solve problems like using inductive and quantitative reasoning with pictures. So here we do subtests like matrix reasoning. So matrix reasoning is where there is some kind of like pattern, and you have to determine what picture you would choose that would like best complete the pattern. And then we often do figure weights where you have to balance scales using shapes. And basically, shapes are assigned like quantitative information. But independent user, like B1, you'd probably be able to pretty well access like this domain. Working memory is the next area. So this is measuring our ability to hold information in our immediate awareness and then to use it within a process or to manipulate it. So to measure this area, we often administer like digit span. So asking students to repeat numbers after us, to put numbers in reverse order, like sequences of numbers, and also to put numbers in order in like an ascending manner. And then we also do picture spans. So we've got a bit of the auditory and then a bit of the visual. So we ask students to remember sequences of pictures. And I consider like working memory kind of like sticky notes because it's kind of for like temporary storage of information. And it's important to note too, if you think like an EAL learner may have a learning disability, but they also might, have significant attention concerns, like more than again what you would expect as typical. Working memory may be specifically impacted just because of the amount of concentration and effort it takes, like sustained effort to engage in the tasks there. And same with processing speed. It can be really impacted because of sustained concentration, the level of sustained concentration that's needed. So processing speed is measuring our ability to quickly process simple information. And here we administer subtests like coding, where you have to pair numbers with symbols, and also a symbol search, where you quickly scan for different symbols. And so, yeah, it's all about visual speed and accuracy. It's not very heavily language loaded. Like working memory would be more of a B2 because you have to have like certain like number skills, but like processing speed, I would say is more of a B1, still independent user though. And And I'm going to touch on some other areas here, and then I'm just going to see if there's any questions so far. So, for intellectual developmental disorders, those 5 areas, you're kind of done. You don't really need to go further if you're finding that students are having difficulty across areas, right? But for a specific learning disability, we really want to get in there and make sure we know any of the underpinning reasons why academic skills aren't developing properly. So we want to look also at long-term storage and retrieval. So our ability to store information and retrieve it later, rapid retrieval, so how quickly can you retrieve information, and then auditory processing. Are you able to discriminate, analyze, and synthesize auditory information? And for all of these, I feel like you'd need like a B2 kind of level still, independent user kind of thing. So before we get into the interpretation, like, so this is now like, how are we going to interpret like this standardized data? Are there any questions about the pre-referral stuff, like the referral stuff, or like those cognitive areas then that we ask students to like engage in? No, not yet. Okay. Oh, yeah, yeah, I can shut the door. It is typical that I think especially EAL students have to wait quite a while to be seen. Sometimes it's for reasons like we want them to have a certain English language proficiency, but often it's also we just don't have the means to provide the assessment. And I think that's where it's important to like advocate for your observations. Again, thinking of what a learning disability looks like as compared to what is language, additional language acquisition, and just like advocate for their needs, almost like as if they have a diagnosis, for those accommodations for exams and stuff like that. But I know it's really tricky, and I wish we could kind of see all of them, but yeah, just need more people everywhere. Interpreting the data now, so this is the bell curve. This is norm reference, not based on our EAL student populations. Most students, I just love this bell curve because there's lots of these little people in here. So most people, just like these little people, fall within the average range, right? So the yellow area. Now, the average range is a little more narrow for our purpose, but it's still kind of broad, 25th to the 75th percentile. So you'll see in our reports a lot of data is reported as percentiles. 50th percentile is actually a really good score. It would be perfectly average. So if you scored at the 50th percentile, you'd be scoring greater than or equal to 50% of individuals the same age. If you're scoring to the right of the yellow band here, then you are showing cognitive skills that are more developed than we would expect. If you're scoring to the left, then your cognitive skills would be less developed than what we would expect. But it's like really, really hard with EAL learners because, again, this isn't a good norm population. So really hard to determine the extent to which cultural and linguistic factors are impacting our assessment data and potentially then outcomes. So this is what the literature suggests, that we use the standardized assessments. And again, I would suggest getting standardized data first and then kind of going in with adjustments if needed. But placing also distinct emphasis on the nonverbal subtests. So I mentioned the fluid reasoning earlier as a core problem-solving area. That can tell us a lot about how students think and reason. And like I said, it's less language and culturally loaded. And actually, we can derive a nonverbal index. So you know how we can get a full scale IQ kind of pulled from our scores? We can get an overall nonverbal index too, and that can show learning that is like ability that is less, again, language culturally loaded. So it pulls from fluid reasoning as well as processing speed and visual spatial skills. There's also like dynamic, like non-standardized dynamic assessment that can occur. So let's say like you're really, really worried about a student, like there's still other ways to go about it. With non-standardized dynamic assessment, basically a psychologist sets up like a learning environment and then observes the learning processes that occur with a student. And then my favorite tool is the Cultural Language Interpretive Matrix, CLIM. This is also by Ortiz, and it can just help us to interpret the data, the standardized data. So let's say you have standardized data, you haven't made any adjustments in getting this data. It's just like you administered as you're supposed to administer. So the CLIM helps us to organize the different areas actually at a subtest level in terms of the degree of cultural loading involved and the degree of linguistic demand. So when you have like a subtest down in the far right corner, that subtest would be high cultural loading, high linguistic demand. And it just helps us to like view all of the information and consider how much our culture and language potentially affecting our scores across areas. But it kind of gets better because it also provides us, like the CLIM provides this graph. So when scores show like a pattern of decline, so we're kind of going low language loading, low cultural loading to high language loading, high cultural loading. So when scores show this decline, then we know that culture and language are significantly impacting scores. But also, if they're within this band, we also know that EAL learners are scoring as we would expect them to score. Now, if you have scores like lower than this band, like that I've circled in red, if they're like lower, then that might be indicating more of like an intellectual developmental disorder if they're like all lower, right? Because they're all lower than we would expect, even with cultural and linguistic factors being kind of accounted for. Now, let's say you have this though, and there's kind of like one area that's like a little lower. And you can go back to your chart and see like, hey, what area was that? Then you might be looking at more of a specific learning disorder, again, with criteria being overall average or better ability and specific difficulties impacting academic learning. And another neat fact about this is when you're inputting your data, you can actually take into account not just like the amount of time like a student's been learning like English, but also like background, like is it slightly different, moderately, markedly? So for like our refugee students, you could input that their background is markedly different, and it will actually kind of like adjust expected results. So it's kind of cool. Sorry. So psychologists that like have the professional development, I guess, in that could administer the CLIM. Yeah, so it's just a really neat way to kind of look at the data. Um, I think that if you have level B qualifications, the PVAT would be something similar in that, again, you're able to compare a score to that of individuals the same age with a similar, at least, amount of time being exposed to English. Eduardo, I don't know. Um, Okay, so I'm just gonna go and try to like finish things. Okay, so neurodevelopmental disorders. So, there's that's what we're considering here in terms of specific learning disabilities. Other neurodevelopmental disorders are like ADHD, autism spectrum disorder. It's important to note that a lot of neurodevelopmental disorders co-occur. So there's a high incidence of comorbidity. So like specific learning disabilities are often diagnosed with ADHD. Um, And like autism spectrum disorder is often diagnosed with intellectual developmental disorder. It doesn't mean always, but it's just important to know that if your learner has one, you might be on the lookout to see if there's anything else going on, or don't be surprised if you're seeing some other behaviors as well. So we already kind of talked about DSM criteria, but I do want to draw attention to something in the DSM. So, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. We're on our 5th edition. Just draw your attention to something kind of interesting. So, the DSM actually notes proficiency in the language of instruction. So, lack of proficiency actually being an exclusional factor. So, you have to really be able to defend a diagnosis and, again, make sure that you've got lots of information over time in different contexts, especially when there can be those language differences. Learning disabilities range from mild to severe. Level of severity really depends on how much support individuals need. This can be tricky with EAL learners too. And then I spoke about how we're looking at dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, like those impairments in reading, writing, and math. One thing I want to mention is you might often see a provisional diagnosis given for EAL learners. So, both for intellectual developmental disorders or learning disabilities. So, provisional diagnoses are given when there's parts of a person's functioning that are unclear. So, this is, so I mentioned the co-occurring thing. I want to just show you, oh, I don't have it here in these slides, but an example of a provisional diagnosis is when we get parent reports that are super different from teacher reports. And for EAL learners, it's really hard to sometimes go ahead with diagnoses because of just those language differences and cultural differences. So sometimes that's an example of when we would provide a provisional diagnosis. And then upon reassessment, we might take that off. But the danger in giving a provisional diagnosis is they're supposed to be kind of updated. And I think your name's Melissa, right? Is that right? No. What's your name? Yeah. Victoria, my bad. Okay, so totally wrong name. But like you were saying, the issue is we don't often get assessment, let alone reassessment, right? But in a perfect world, we would look to like take off that provisional and kind of make sure we've got it right. When I think about students who have assessment needs, I think about effort not matching achievement, lack of progress with intervention, very slow learning, and behind expected EAL linguistic outcomes. However, like Heather and I had a case recently where like the EAL benchmarks for a student, they were coming along perfectly fine. But then in class, they were saying like she can't learn. Basically, she's having a lot of difficulty learning, sorry. And we kind of determined that the student likely has a learning disability. So that would be like the very slow learning, right? And again, these students aren't like students with learning disabilities aren't globally affected. So they might exit out of EAL programs, but then a teacher might say, like, hey, they're having like a lot of difficulty. Like, what's going on here? Like, she's not able to comprehend what she's reading. And they might think like she needs more EAL support when really there are cognitive difficulties that are constraining that reading comprehension specifically. So reassessment needs, I just mentioned with provisional diagnosis. And then sometimes we need to reassess if functioning isn't representative of an individual any longer, if their previous report isn't really describing what you're seeing at all. And sometimes learners have more subtle onset. And so it really takes reassessment when the like gaps grow as an individual ages and academic expectations increase over time. It really takes that time to be able to say, yeah, they're meeting a clinical threshold for a diagnosis. They're meeting all of the criteria. SLDs are pretty common. So in approximately 5 to 10% of school-age children, and it doesn't really matter your language or culture. So yeah, so just in kind of summarizing the literature for this project across across like the referral process and then the assessment process and the interpretation. These are kind of my main takeaways. It's really important to gather multiple sources of data. The referral process that you start at the beginning should be informing every stage of the assessment because it should be informing the adjustments that might be needed to cognitive assessment, informing how information is interpreted, like is the student's background markedly different? It's really important to know, especially if you're going to go in with something like the CLIM. And also, it should make sense. Like the data should make sense to the referral and have ecological validity or ecological validity. I always pronounce that wrong. So in other words, it should make sense to what you see in the learner in the real world. And yeah, we want to keep learning. And like, I just think a really robust framework is almost needed, like where we have a like our own almost standardized processes of what we need, like the information we need at each stage in order to make sure this is like as equitable as possible in terms of the outcomes, because the outcomes can really impact the learners. Like if a learner is misdiagnosed with an intellectual developmental disorder, they could end up in a program that constrains their future post-secondary education. Or if a student has an LD, but they're not given a diagnosis, then they might not access accommodations. So it's just, I feel like it's so important, like in like, yeah, like almost a justice way to like get this right. And then again, just it's really important to advocate for the needs of EAL learners who might not yet be able to partake in like those different cognitive subtest activities that we would need them to be able to partake in for specific learning disability diagnosis. So for like intellectual disabilities, like I was saying, there's kind of a little way you can get around it really with like developmental milestones charts and play-based assessment, but not so much for specific learning disabilities. And so that's everything. Are there any questions? And if you do want to read more on this stuff, these are some resources. So yeah, and there's like the CLIM information's at the bottom if you're interested in learning more about that. The middle resource, they're like the ones that were pretty big on the adjustments to standardization. You could use some of those again if you note them, especially in academic assessment, like Kaufman or Ouellette. And yeah, so that's everything. Thank you.